Hey friends, it's your friendly neighborhood game master Zach Hall here. This is recording this after I've done some dev diaries for 2D20, but I've decided that I need to do a little bit of like groundwork. I jumped in assuming a few things about the 2D20 SRD that I now realize isn't were bad assumptions after trying to like kind of build my own thing using it without reading it entirely. I kind of trusted that it was the same as Star Trek Adventures, and 90% of it is, but it's a little different. A couple of things, and there's just some good stuff, and maybe this will be useful to you, the viewer, if you are interested in learning the 2D20 system for like if you want to jump in and learn something that is going to get you 80 to 90% of the way there for any of Modiphius's 2D20 games, this would be a good resource. If you are a game master or game developer who is looking to use the 2D20 SRD to create your own games, this is exactly for you because that's what I'm doing. So we're going to jump in. This is going to be like a classic Zach reading the PDF video. Great to put on in the background. Great to have pulled up your own PDF. The PDF for this is free. I'm not showing anything. I'm not going to be nervous about sitting on a page or skipping any pages to not get myself in trouble by providing paid content for free. This is free. So the link to the entire kit for 2D20's SRD is available in the doobie-doo below. Best bet, if you are actually learning this, go and download that, unzip it, take a look at the PDF. That's what I'm going to be looking for. They've broken it out into chapters in like Word docs, which is great I use it because it's a little easier for me to read. I've uploaded them to like Google Drive, converted them. My editing is happening a lot there, but I'm just going to use the PDF because I've also created some bookmarks in the PDF so I can jump around a little easier. Pause this, go grab the PDF, and then we can read along together. I don't think this video is going to cover everything. I imagine I will have to break this up into parts. That makes sense. I'm not going to sit here. Well, I might actually be sitting here for 3 hours covering the whole thing. I imagine I will be breaking the video up into parts that make sense. So here's the PDF, and here's just kind of the overview at the beginning of the PDF, the different chapters that the PDF covers. As you can see, the 2D20 system is a system and tool set for creating and playing games that emulate and celebrate action-packed, story-driven fiction. Thrives when paired with a setting or a theme where competent, determined, often larger-than-life protagonists face tense and perilous situations. Collaboration and teamwork are vital to success. So this system existed before. Modiphius built it not for Star Trek Adventures. I believe Conan and maybe their Lovecraftian horror book came out before Star Trek Adventures did. But I would say Star Trek Adventures probably put the system on the map just because of its IP is popular. It is still a current being built and developed system that people are enjoying every single day. And I would say that overview or statement of intent for the 2D20 system fits perfectly with Star Trek. Larger than life protagonists that are competent, where collaboration and teamwork are vital. That describes Star Trek really well, like at a setting free base level. I also think it fits Stargate, which is why I am using this SRD and system to build a homebrew hack, whatever you want to call it, of Stargate. For Stargate, for my own personal use, it will not be a product because I do not own the IP. Amazon owns the IP after acquiring MGM like 4 or 5 years ago, which is why I believe the D25E based system crashed and burned. Well, I have a couple thoughts on why it didn't really work, but it's definitely one of them. But so we've got a chapter on the core rules, a chapter devoted to characters. This entire document is for game devs. Chapter 2, though, lots to pick here. This is why I jumped into creating characters first, figuring out how characters were going to function in like what a character sheet might look like first, because that kind of dictates a lot of other things. But as it turns out, if you don't know the core rules, maybe building characters isn't like the best way to go. So then we got action and conflict. This is the largest chapter in terms of page count, though a lot of this is which makes sense. Like in combat, things all of a sudden matter a great deal, and there needs to be. I would agree with the premise. The action and conflict, combat, whatever you want to call it, needs to be the most developed part of the game when it comes to having the most specific rules, where everything else I think can be less so, especially because everything else for the most part you can't cover every base, where in combat you probably do want to cover as many bases as you can, or create a box that things cannot happen outside of so that your rules would apply. So we got our entire chapter on equipment, adversaries, and NPCs. Then there's this whole document, it really is for game masters and game developers, but this is specifically like advice and stuff. And then some additional rules that I probably won't cover because none of them really apply to me and what I'm looking to do. I don't think that I would need an entire subsystem for hacking and electronic warfare. That isn't really part of the stories I usually would tell in Stargate. But maybe I could be wrong. Magic, supernatural powers, corruption, and creeping darkness, definitely not part of a Stargate game. But if you were wanting to create a high fantasy or urban fantasy game and include magic, there is some sections on that. Cool. So let's jump in. This is continuing in like the introduction or overview, but this is the basic stuff. So this kind of clearly comes in with like talking that this is a dice pool system where you start with 2d20s and are frequently adding more in order to increase your chances of success. So this game uses several d20s, at least 2 everybody should have. I would say ideally every player's got 5, but maybe like if your table doesn't have that much dice, every player should have 2, and then a central pool of dice that they can grab from at the middle of the table or what have you. Then d6s, these are mainly on like to roll like random events on tables. And then there's the challenge dice. These are also d6s. They're usually for inflicting damage or making progress against a challenge. In this document, it's noted by CD in brackets, which is kind of an annoying format to me. In my head, in my writing, I have always used the square brackets to denote to myself, like, hey, here's some here's something that I haven't completely decided yet, or like this is a name or something for or a value that changes. I guess in that last instance, CD might apply because however many challenge dice you're rolling kind of depends, but CD are fundamentally a little different than D6s because it's not a range from 1 to 6, but rather 3 results. You can either get a 1, get a 2, or an icon. On a D6, as you can see here in the table, you roll a 1, you get a 1. If you roll a 2, you get a 2. A 3 or 4 is a 0. Then 5 or 6 is a 1 plus an icon, and that icon usually triggers some kind of special effect, potentially from an effect. You might need an effect in order to trigger an effect from a talent or a piece of equipment that you are using. Re-rolling comes in a lot. There's no such thing as really like advantage as far as I know in 2d20, but there are instances where you get to see a dice roll and then re-roll that through some kind of, there's multiple mechanics. Could be a talent, could be expending a player resource called momentum, which I'm sure we will get to. Rerolls come up often. The new results replace the old, even if it's worse. You don't get to pick between the two. And then some situations allow for a specific number of dice to be rolled, while others allow for all the dice in a pool to be re-rolled. In essence, players can always choose not to re-roll a die if you wish to keep the result. So it's always a may, not a will type situation. Then we got pen to paper. Probably need it. Tokens, beads, or chips. I agreed. This is one of those things that like D&D, you don't really need anything outside of dice and a character sheet and like a pen or pencil at base. But in with this, there are some additional resources that are best tracked with something on the tables. Like, of course, Modiphius, the developer, sells like little tokens and coins and stuff like that to use to track momentum and threat. You don't have to do that. Even something as simple as poker chips, extra dice. If you have like if you're a dice goblin and have a ton, just like doesn't matter what face is on it, but just the fact that you have the dice represents you have a piece of momentum or threat or something like that. Feature called Luck, which isn't a part of Star Trek Adventures, so I don't completely know what that subsystem is, or if I will use it. So I'm sure we will get to it. So here's some basic concepts about characters, like their attributes and their skills. For my game, I've customized these. I'm still not completely settled on it. Talked about that a lot in my first 2 dev diary videos, which are up and you can go check out. If you are a game developer and looking to customize your game, this is probably where you're going to be customizing it the most, because the character's attributes and skills determine how good they are at something, how often they're going to succeed at specific types of tasks. The way it works is you essentially pick an attribute and then you pick a skill that applies to whatever the task or challenge that a character is attempting. I believe that this should be a conversation between the GM and the player. That there should be I would say more times than not, maybe 6 times out of 10, there should be a kind of meta conversation happening between the player and the GM, with the player kind of being allowed to kind of fight for and explain why they would like to use X attribute and Y skill. And the GM can kind of determine if that fits the situation. Where on the flip side, often as a GM, when I'm playing 5e or even Pathfinder, similar games, I would prefer my players not tell me what they want to roll. I would prefer for the player to say what the character wants to accomplish in the fiction of the game, and then I can tell them what to roll. There's just a lot more meta conversations happening in 2D20, I think, and one of those is that conversation of like, what do you want to roll? Because often I think approach is a term used by similar games where the player kind of gets to try to argue for a specific approach. It's because at the end of the day, the player knows how their character would be approaching a task, and oftentimes mentally or from attitude wise, how that character is approaching the task will change what attribute and skill they're going to roll. If you're a first-time GM looking to potentially run a 2D20 game, just encourage you, like, that doesn't need to be a hard and set thing, especially outside of combat. If you are essentially role playing and someone wants to accomplish something that you determine isn't just an automatic success, that they do need to roll, let the player have a hand in deciding what attribute and or skill they want to roll for it. In combat, that this becomes a little more set in stone, which we'll get to in the combat chapter. But just some personal advice, more from Zach than from the book. Though the book might say it in chapter 6, talk about game mastering. So a basic part is scene. The scene's a place and time involving a specific set of people during which exciting dramatic events occur. I think most of this GMs probably understand intrinsically, but they do. It is a scene is actually a mechanic in 2D20 that is worth kind of knowing and acknowledging. The GM sets the scene. Once the GM is finished setting the scene, players can ask questions about the situation and choose for your characters to do things within the scene. And once you've reached a point where you can't really do anything more towards your goal in the scene, where you gain a new goal that requires you to go somewhere else, where the scene ends and a new one begins. And this does matter, changing scenes, because it does tie, like, certain things last. The duration is for a scene, and when the scene changes, a resource might change or get updated or taken away. Just have to be a little bit more mindful. But for me, I think it's helpful in like GM prep, like thinking of things as a scene and kind of planning for things in the scene specific to what are the players trying to accomplish, what's the goal they're trying to accomplish, and what in this scene propels them towards that goal. Helpful reframing that has helped change how I prep for my games in general, not just D20 or 2D20 games. Then you have skill tests. State your intent to the GM. The GM will consider the situation and decide if you can get what you want, if your goal is impossible to achieve, or if you need a skill test. If you do need a skill test, the GM will tell you 3 things: which attribute to use, which skill to use, and what the difficulty is. Like, so they're directly calling out that it is a GM determination which attribute and skill you'll use, and that doesn't presuppose what I was kind of discussing a few minutes ago. I'd still think that this should be a conversation, which attribute and skill you should use. Difficulty, 100% up to the GM, because what you might not know, or what a player doesn't know, is probably what is determining how difficult a task is, and only the GM can know what a player doesn't know. And at the end of the day, of course, the GM has final say in this. I do think the game is better when there's a meta conversation about it. So then you add your attributes and skills up together, and then you are attempting to roll under that number. That total number of your attributes and skills is your target number. The goal on each individual dice is to roll under the target number. So if you add up your attribute and skill and that number is a 14, you are at least going to roll 2 d20s. And the hope on each individual dice is that the dice rolls under that target number. If it does roll under that target number, it is a success. And once that success counts towards hopefully overcoming the difficulty. You add up, we can talk about focuses in just a second. Any dice that rolls equal to or less than your target number is a success. Then set aside any dice that rolled a 20. That'll be important in a moment. Again, this is a roll low system. Rolling a natural 20 is a bad thing in 2d20. It's going to be a mishap. So you add up all the successes that you scored. If you scored successes equal to or greater than the difficulty, you succeeded at the skill test. And then if you scored fewer than the difficulty, you failed. Simple example, the character's trying to accomplish something, an attribute and skill to roll is picked, and that total number is a 14, and the GM announces that it is a difficulty 2 task. And this is assuming the character or the player has no way of purchasing additional d20s, though often they could, but we haven't talked about that yet. So in our example, they are just rolling 2 d20s, and the hope is that both dice roll under the target number of 14 or equal to. They roll the dice. 1 is a 12 and 1 is a 8. That is 2 successes. Congrats, you accomplished this skill task. Move along. One dice rolled is a 12, but 1 is a 16. That is only 1 success, but you didn't roll any mishaps or complications with a natural 20. So then I believe there's going to be, like, in a future page talking about succeeding at a cost. Like, you didn't completely fail. You might want to try to have a conversation with your GM and say, hey, and have a conversation about, okay, or the GM will offer, probably more often than not, the GM will offer, hey, would you like to succeed at cost? That cost being voluntarily taking a complication or a mishap. You'd have that conversation. On the flip side, going back to our example, if the target number is 14, 1 dice rolled a 12, that's a success, and the other dice rolled a 1, that is a critical success and counts as 2 successes. So you technically had 3 successes, 1 more than the difficulty of the task that you were attempting. If you succeeded by getting more successes than the difficulty, each extra success becomes a point of momentum. You can spend those points to improve the outcome of your test, gaining more information from a search, hitting more accurately with attack, or taking less time to do something, so forth. Generating momentum and then spending momentum on a success is a way of giving yourself a way to provide even more of an advantage for you and your party because of how well you performed in the task. If you rolled any 20, critical failure, a 20 is a mishap, a little problem that happens. This can't turn success into failure, but they are extra challenges, incidents, or events that have cropped up you must now contend with. So it could be that you succeeded in your attack, but now your gun's out of ammo. Or you succeeded at the task that you were accomplishing, but you took too much time doing it, and now you're gonna have to like make a choice of A or B to figure out like what do we do now. Or maybe you made a mess during the search, so not like maybe you found what you're looking for, but it's obvious that someone was in here looking for something. Well, I love this example. Or that handhold you used while climbing broke after you used it. So your character succeeded, but another character was really counting on being able to use the same path that you did, but something happens and now they can't. This game is really GM like storytelling heavy. Like there aren't often like a set consequence when a skill task is failed or when a mishap occurs. Like it kind of happens on the fly. A GM can feel like that's putting a lot of pressure on them to be really good at improvising stuff. And maybe it is. But remember that this is a collaborative storytelling game and that the party can also suggest things. This game works really well when you are playing with a group of players who are not bummed when they roll a mishap. Maybe they aren't excited and looking forward to it because that caused maybe a little too much chaos, can be its own kind of downer sometimes. But if for the players that are really hoping to succeed really well but aren't bummed when something wrong happens and offer up solutions of like a good suggestion on what that mishap can be in the fiction, so great. Like that's kind of the ideal situation, an absolute dream. Alternatively, as a GM, you always have an out. If there isn't an obvious in fiction consequence for rolling a mishap, or there is one and you want to be a little nice to your players without just letting them skate by, the GM can save the problem for later, adding 2 points to the threat pool instead. If you want, the player could even ask the GM to add to threat instead of facing a new problem immediately. So this is part of that conversations of like this is a collaborative group storytelling environment. In an ideal world, players and GMs are having this meta conversation back and forth about the mechanics and successes, failures, that kind of thing. So let's talk about momentum and threat. These are kind of like the last really big pieces of the system that you need to know before you can kind of move on. And I would say as a player, if you understood the 8 pages of the overview for this game and this SRD, I would say you could probably go in with at least a semi-experienced GM. You could go in and have a great time playing 2D20 and understanding how the absolute basics work. So momentum, you can get momentum when you succeed at a task with more successes than the difficulty for the task. So for each additional success, you gain a momentum. Momentum can be used for all kinds of things, limited only by your imagination and the GM's permission. Notice this is talking to the players. So notice whose imagination? You, the player, and the GM's. So the onus by Raw is kind of like, hey, you, the player, are kind of responsible for kind of thinking of in fiction ways to spend your momentum. Now, there are explicit ways spelled out in the rules for how to use momentum. So it's not completely up to a player to invent something off the cuff. But the onus is on the player's imagination and then the GM saying yes or no to that idea. So spending momentum allows you to turn mere success into glorious triumph, achieving goals swiftly and in style, pulling off daring stunts and spectacular feats of prowess. Momentum represents the benefits of success, the small but crucial opportunities and advantages you and your friends create with your success and decisive actions, and the value found in teamwork, being patient, resourceful, and tactical. There are a few common ways to spend momentum, which pretty much always apply. You can spend momentum to buy extra dice on a future skill test, or to make an opponent's skill test more difficult. You can spend momentum to alter the scene, or otherwise create some advantage to capitalize upon later. This can be done in a couple ways, but the game defaults to using traits, which if you've ever played or run in a Fate game where, and maybe other systems too, but I'm most familiar with it in Fate, where there are explicit and like named traits in a scene. You can spend momentum to alter, remove, or add traits to a scene that create advantages for you and potentially disadvantages for your opponents. You can spend momentum to ask the GM questions about the situation, gaining extra information with each point of momentum spent. This one is a really important one in Star Trek Adventures because the gap between what you, the player, knows and what your character knows is huge. You are the rule set assumes you are playing an incredibly competent, and in a game like Star Trek Adventures, and as I'm kind of assuming in my Stargate game, your character is highly competent. They are either specialized skills in something that you've never had any experience in, or have specialized high education in a subject you do not know. That covers the gambit in Star Trek, where there's new tech that is completely in the fiction and doesn't have like a base understanding in reality. You can't go study warp cores outside of some fan fiction or maybe some supplementary material you can find online. Something like Stargate, you've got people who are PCs on teams that are physics experts, Egyptologists, linguists, things that maybe, yeah, you as a player have a like passionate hobby fascination with, but the difference between what your character knows is vast. So having a built-in way of asking the GM for more information that your character would know is a hugely important piece of playing 2D20. So you also can save up momentum putting it in a group pool to use later. I often find this is probably the most likely situation, is that if there isn't an obvious way to use your momentum or to keep things going, you can just put that momentum in a group pool that other people can use later. So as a group, you and your fellow players can have up to 6 points of momentum saved up at any time. And whenever you succeed at a skill test, you can spend momentum from that group pool alongside or instead of spending momentum that you generated on the skill test. So as long as you have some momentum in your group pool available to you when you succeed on a test, you just have to succeed before you can spend momentum. You do not have to generate momentum on your own skill test before diving into that group pool, which is super helpful. Or you can use that momentum before you roll in order to gain extra dice. Like if you starting with 2d20s for your skill test, but the difficulty is kind of high, a 3. Well, do you want to count on you rolling a critical success in order to get that third success that you need? Or would you like to spend a point of momentum and try to add to your dice pool to potentially be rolling 3, maybe even 4 dice in order to try to succeed at that difficulty 3 skill test? Sometimes you won't have enough momentum available to achieve what you want to achieve. And in these situations, you can take risks, brave the uncertain, and make your own luck by adding to threat. Threat is the inverse or opposite of momentum, where momentum is a player-used resource that is used by the players to make the players' lives easier and better. Threat is all that, but for the GM, where the GM has his own pool of threat that they get to use in order to make the characters' lives more complicated, difficult, or dangerous. Momentum and threat is my favorite thing about 2D20. I like a lot of things about 2D20, but I love the push and pull and the economy that occurs when between threat and momentum at the table. Just the mere presence of a certain amount of threat can ramp up the tension felt at the table, because the players might feel like we're going into a situation, we're going to do the best we can, but gosh, look, the GM has 4 threat that they can use to make our lives really difficult. The GM doesn't have to do anything extra. They don't have to describe the scene in any more sinister of a way. They don't have to go out of their way to add more combatants to a scene. They can just have a lot of threat in their threat pool that the threat of the threat makes the players kind of sweat and doubt and consider, are we doing the right thing? And I love that. I love that. And I love that in genres, 2D20 I think does its best in genres with plot armor. Star Trek has a lot of plot armor. Conan Conan has plot armor. Stargate has a lot of plot armor. Like the characters are doing things that no other person, even in the world, would be able to would probably be able to accomplish just by the fact that they are the main characters in that story, that episode. And that is kind of represent like what momentum represents or can represent. It's the fact that your character is better and more special than just another NPC. And I love that. Those are the kind of stories I love telling. I know a lot of people love the like gritty, dark, really grounded, realistic simulation type games. That is not what I personally enjoy. I enjoy part of me does enjoy the reset that happens at the end of us at 98% of Star Trek episodes, where like we go back to the status quo. There was a conflict and there was tension in the 43-minute episode, and for the most part that tension gets overcome. Maybe there was some consequences short term. Very rarely was there a like long-term consequence, but stuff happens. But then everything kind of goes back to normal, goes back to the status quo. The next episode starts, and very, very often there does not need to be a recap of what happened the last episode, because what happened last episode doesn't really impact the next one. There is something kind of calm, cool, collected, and satisfying, reassuring about that. That's not everybody's cup of tea. And for running a 2D20 campaign, maybe you do want to lean more into the like last 2 or 3 seasons of Deep Space Nine more than you want to lean into like season 2 of Star Trek Next Generation, where the status quo does change episode to episode. And like in this instance, in the metaphor, I think multiple sessions of your game are probably it takes multiple sessions to complete an episode. I don't think you can, more often than not, I don't think pen and paper play groups can accomplish an entire like A plot, maybe a B plot that would happen in a Star Trek episode in one like 3 to 4 hour play session. We giggle and goof off too much. So 2 or 3 sessions per episode. Then you can string those episodes along into story arcs where the quota does change, and those arcs can become seasons, and a couple seasons, and you've got a full-fledged campaign of like you can play this for a very long time. All right, so that was just the overview. Here's the actual core rules. Scenes and situations. We kind of know what this looks like. Establishing a scene. This is talking about traits. A scene's defined by its location, events occurring there at a specific time, and the people who are there. These elements are all facts about a scene that can influence the actions that characters wish to and are able to attempt. In this system, these facts are collectively regarded as traits. Each trait is a single word or a short phrase which describes a single significant fact about whatever it is the trait belongs to. As traits represent significant facts, they represent the things that are important to know about the scene, the kinds of elements which are the most obvious when a scene begins. Imagine the details that are most obvious when a scene begins in a movie or TV show, or the elements the author describes as scenes unfold in a novel. There may be lots of insignificant facts, but they're just that, insignificant, so they don't need to be defined. If something becomes important, it becomes a trait. If a trait stops being important or stops being true, it stops being a trait. There's a couple sidebars here. Again, like, don't knock this PDF on formatting. It's an SRD for a reason. It's meant to be simple and kind of cheap to produce. That's why there's almost no layout. It's basically just a Word doc that was exported as a PDF. I, as a matter of fact, like this. And outside of it being like not being able to be made in dark mode, I wish more rule books were like this. Makes for much easier reading. It's way more accessible. And as a guy who does a lot of reading on handheld devices, preferring them in dark mode whenever possible because it's easier on my eyes, this kind of formatting is great. So here's a sidebar about traits, where traits don't need to be formally defined. If the GM and players are comfortable with it, traits can be informal, just handled as part of a normal part of play. In a situation, the GM applies the influence of traits by themselves as a natural part of adjudicating the game without specifically referring to them as traits. Rather than having a torrential rain trait in play, the GM simply applies the effects of rain whenever they feel it's relevant. This does somewhat lessen the player's ability to interact with traits as a mechanic. This may suit some groups who care less about the mechanics and more about the story. This is super helpful because I was exposed first to this system through the Star Trek Adventures actual play Shields of Tomorrow that came out via Geek and Sundry, RIP, and that playgroup didn't use formal traits. When I started reading about the system, I was surprised to see kind of fate-esque traits clearly like defined and as a mechanic, where it's suggested to have things like sticky notes that you can write one trait down like per sticky note and kind of have those out on the table when setting up a new scene so that the players can use them to reference. It does mean that there's kind of one less thing to kind of really do with momentum, because you could spend momentum to create an advantage for yourself temporarily by maybe adding in a trait that someone could then rely on to reduce the difficulty of a task the next time or increase the difficulty of an enemy's task next time. But that group was all really good like improvisers and storytellers. Even the folks that weren't necessarily huge Star Trek nerds were they are used to being on camera or in front of a crowd or audience and doing things potentially unplanned. So I think it made sense for that group that they didn't really need to define. Maybe for your group, where maybe it would be helpful for them to have this like some handles to be able to like tactile, I don't know the right adjective for that, be able to them like to grasp like, oh, it's raining, but it's not just raining, it's raining as a trait, which means that we can use the rain in our like the mechanics of our play. It's not just the GM being descriptive. And I think that might be helpful for some play groups. So they default to using traits, but they do call out here in a sidebar that it might not be necessary for your group. And then here's like, if emphasizing traits as a core part of the game, the GM's encouraged to note down traits, or perhaps only most important ones, and place them in full view of the players, perhaps on index card or other note paper. Yep. So they're basically in these sidebars, pros and cons of focusing or defocusing on traits. If you decide to kind of put traits in the background, it can lessen the player's ability to interact with traits, and I would say like with the scene mechanically. But that might be fine for people who are really comfortable role playing in the fiction or in the story, where maybe a con for really focusing on traits so heavily that you're like writing them down and putting them in the player's hands, it can be distracting, pull players' immersion out of the situation. But it does sit better with players who want to engage with the game mechanics in more depth. I wouldn't necessarily put this as a like fiction versus mechanics argument. This is more a comfortability with like playing in the fiction. It's not necessarily that a group wants to be more crunchy or engage with the mechanics more. It might just be that they're less comfortable living in this made up world in our heads at the table. Giving them something physical like a trait or traits of a scene that they can kind of latch onto can be really useful. Traits are useful in adjudicating what isn't possible, as well as how difficult some activities are to attempt. So maybe a con of devaluing or not focusing on traits very much is that if your player's really argumentative about the difficulty values, since they are kind of DC's target numbers, any kind of similar mechanic in games are either subjective and left up to the GM, or extremely explicit and spelled out in the rules, and the GM has to like memorize or constantly be looking up what this DC should be. I am on the former end of the spectrum, where I would rather the GM adjudicate instead of needing to memorize and keep track of a bunch of stuff, tables, and that's because I have an anxiety and a fear of doing something wrong, and it's clearly wrong if there is a right answer. My anxiety is lessened when I could be wrong, but there isn't a right answer that I could just look up. I feel less bad about it. So here's some broad categories. We got location traits. Probably a scene should probably have at least one location trait. Simple description like city, street, or rowdy tavern. And these traits exist as long as the location does. Characters are affected by location traits when they interact with the location itself. Situation trait, darkness, notable weather, or some circumstantial fact or presence in the scene, like bustling crowds or heavy traffic, or situation traits. They affect any character in the scene, but they can often be changed through character action. And then a personal trait describes the nature or state of a character or creature. In some cases, this may be some innate and permanent quality, such as the species of an animal or alien, which defines how the creature interacts with the world. And in others, it may be something potentially changeable, like a mood, emotion, or belief, or an injury, or a hindrance. Characters are affected by their own personal traits and those of any characters they interact with. And then equipment traits describe single item, object, or tool. They're permanent so long as the item functions, a trait exists, and can be passed between characters as desired. An equipment trait affects the character using that item to perform some appropriate activity. Now, I don't love equipment as traits, though for some games and game groups, I see the appeal of not really wanting to have to explicitly spell out every single piece of equipment that you use, rather just based on the fiction and the story that you're telling, and maybe some related traits like a personal trait or a location trait that, okay, we can just assume, or the player brings up something like, hey, I think I would have a flashlight in this situation. You do, and then it kind of gets added as a trait to like the scene or the character, as opposed to like added on a like inventory sheet. This appeals to me less than all the others, though I understand its place. I would much rather have either the item doesn't really mechanically benefit and therefore can just be part of the story in fiction and doesn't really need to be anything other than that. There is a set mechanical value to it that the characters and party can depend on like session to session, and therefore should probably be written down and specified, which at that point is more than a trait, and it's a defined piece of equipment that lives on like in an inventory list on a character sheet. That's just my personal opinion. So as soon as what a trait represents stop being the case or stops being true, that trait vanishes or changes to one that reflects it, such as it being dark being replaced by brightly lit when a location's lights turned on. And this example is probably what turns a lot of GMs and playgroups off to using traits, because you don't, as often, something as simple as turning the lights on, having to like then go and write down a new trait. I could absolutely see what the sidebar was talking about in terms of like breaking immersiveness, distracting players, blah, blah, blah. That would be, but that's probably like, could potentially what they're talking about when equipment. The dark room, well, another like a character has a flashlight, they turn it on. How do we represent that? Like, if we're going to be writing stuff down about the scene, how do we represent that change? Well, it's through traits. Do we want to bookkeep that trait? So maybe some stuff gets listed physically on a card as a trait, and some stuff that maybe the GM assumes is going to be changed somehow, leave it on, like, you don't have to change it. Like, if you walk into a dark room, but the first thing the players are going to do is turn a light on, just tell them that the light's off and that it's dark in the room. They turn the light on. You saved yourself 45 seconds of like writing down an index card, scratching it out, and like writing a new one. Traits is probably the most controversial is the wrong word, but probably has the most conversation about how it should work, like play table to play table, GM to GM. The effect that traits have upon the game is more than just descriptive. They help the GM determine what is and what isn't possible, and how easy or difficult things are to achieve. In rules terms, they do one of the following things. If the trait has no impact on the activity, it doesn't have an effect. If the trait's beneficial, you can allow an activity to be attempted that couldn't be attempted otherwise. You can make that activity easier by like decreasing the difficulty. If the trait's detrimental to the task trying to be performed, you could just prevent outright an activity from being attempted. But mechanically, you would describe that. That's not just a GM saying, no, you can't attempt that. It's, no, you can't attempt that because of this adverse trait on the scene. If you can figure out a way to remove or change that trait, then you can attempt that check. That's one of those things with like, okay, like usually that's the kind of thing that is just described by the GM out loud. But at the same time, maybe there's just bad GMs or not great GMs that just say no and don't tell the player why they can't. The player thinks they're getting shut down when really they are, but it's temporarily. Having these traits clearly defined and being able to be spoken about in this way means that the player understands they're not just being shut down, they are that, and it gives them like next steps. Like, what am I going to do next? Oh, well, I really wanted to do that activity. So what I'm actually going to do, instead of doing that activity, finding out that I can't because of this trait, I'm going to figure out a way to get rid of that trait or change it so that I can do that activity, which is useful. If a trait should have a particularly potent or intense effect, larger effect than those listed above, the GM should simply make it multiple identical traits, essentially creating a single trait that has the effect of many. That seems annoying. But I get what they're trying to say is like, well, if the effect is so large that instead of just increasing the difficulty step by 1, it increases it by 2 or 3, we need to represent that in a way. Or if we don't want, like, sometimes it's a fairly trivial task to overcome a single trait situationally, like a situation trait in a scene. So we don't want to make it seem like you can just do another kind of simple task to get rid of the trait. You might need to achieve multiple activities, multiple tasks to get rid of the trait, representing it in a way. I don't exactly know how I would run that at my table, if I'm being honest. I'm not sure. It's just an interesting thing. Positive and negative traits. Some traits are specifically good or bad for some characters within a scene, normally because of the actions of characters. Where most traits are inherently neutral, they don't naturally favor anyone. Many of those created during a scene will belong to a specific character, may tend to be helpful to one side or another. A positive trait is inherently good for its owner, with a negative being inherently bad for its owner. So positive and negative traits can cancel each other out. A character may seek to create a positive trait to negate the effects of a negative one, such as securing a source of light to help see through darkness. And then let's look at this sidebar. What hinders you helps me. When a situation would allow a positive or negative trait to be created, the character who creates them may create the opposite type of trait and apply it to someone on the opposing side. So basically, instead of a PC creating a positive trait for themselves, they may choose to create a negative trait on an opponent. That makes sense. So we have tasks and skill tests. This is obviously like the main like conflict resolution system, which is often how pen and paper TTRPGs are defined. I like their use of sidebars here in order to like provide some context or maybe a variant or optional rule for GMs, game developers. So this like no but sidebar, it's important that the GM make it clear that the answer to a task might only be temporary. And they're kind of phrasing it that a player should just assume that the GM's their answer might be temporary. But I do think it's probably beneficial for the GM to also call out to no, but there are ways you can make this a yes. If you don't want to provide a clear path of how to make it become a yes, because like you want the players to still be in the dark a little bit, I think that's totally fine. You can come up with ways to say it differently. I also think that in the games I'm imagining running, it's probably a situation where the GM needs the ability to kind of provide next steps for the players. Star Trek, Stargate, there's so many. It's not as simple as this person got kidnapped, they went down in this X dungeon, go like through this grid of dungeon map and rescue the person. Usually more a little like complicated or less defined than that. In this game does not assume gridded maps. Often like if combat might just be zones, everything might be theater of the mind in this game. So my personal experience running games is that when everything is in theater of the mind, the players don't realize they have more options because they can contribute to the fiction themselves. because things are less defined. Where on a gridded map, oftentimes players assume that what is on the map is 100% of available truth. They don't ask fun or like fiction like adding to the fiction questions. Where to all theater of the mind, but like there's like as long as the player's confident in what they're doing, the possibilities are endless. And oftentimes humans can get analysis by paralysis when there's seemingly infinite options. Even if there aren't actually infinite options, player might not know what to do next if they aren't confident, if they aren't proactive, if they aren't decisive. So the GM having a way of like, hey, go, if you do this, this can become a yes. I think that's important. What's at stake? The GM should have a clear idea of what a skill test is for and what will happen if the task succeeds or fails. The test is an attempt to achieve something, and if it succeeds, the character gets what they want, and if it fails, they don't get it. This might be to create, change, or remove a trait currently in play. The skill test is to avoid or resist danger. In this case, success means the character avoids the danger, while failure means they suffer the danger. Skill test is to achieve something, but there's something at stake as well. Success means that the character got what they wanted and avoided the consequences, while failure means they might suffer the consequences instead or choose to face the consequences if they want to achieve their goal. Players should be informed of the potential outcomes for success or failure before the skill test is attempted. Player characters are assumed to be capable enough to know the most likely outcomes for their actions. This again puts a lot on the GM. Like you, the GM, needs you need to take a moment when the player suggests something and like think about, okay, what happens if they succeed? What happens if they fail? And oftentimes I think we as people and humans are determined to reduce all like any bouts of silence at the table, or that if it takes you a couple seconds, 10, 20, maybe even 30 seconds to think about what's going to happen, that you don't appear to be as like good or qualified or skilled a GM. And I just want to go ahead and say, well, that's silly. I identify with that, and it's taken a lot of work and experience for me to just like know that I'm good at what I do. And the reason why I'm good is because I know this game will be better if I take 15 seconds to think about it before just word vomiting or agreeing to something without having a clear idea of what's going to happen at the end of it. Even in my D20, like my D&D games now, I do my best to not allow myself to allow or ask for a roll if I don't have a really clear definition in my head of what's going to happen based on what they roll. I fall to while I love a lot of what I've learned from watching other GMs play D&D, like in big games like Critical Role or Dimension 20, what we don't know, like what you don't often see is what the DM has in their head. So to me, I often be like, oh, they're asking for a role either as a stall or as like this, I've got 3 things I could tell you, and depending on how well you roll, I might give you 0 to 3 of those things, where that isn't really rules as written how it's supposed to happen. And in this game specifically, it is still a success or a failure, even if there are sometimes situations where the failure or the success can come at a cost. But you still have to have those successes and failures clearly defined before the roll happens. So we've already talked about how these skill checks work. They do call out here that attributes range from 7 to 12, and then the skills run from a 1 to a 5. So you add those numbers together to get your target number that you're trying to meet or get under when rolling your d20s. Difficulty is any number from 0 to 5, but in extreme cases can go higher. Some skill tests may have a default difficulty listed in the rules, but circumstances, usually represented by traits, affect those basic difficulties. The difficulty is the number of successes the player must generate. Based on how many successes, can determine how much momentum or threat is generated. The difficulty can be adjusted further by spending momentum or threat. Each die that rolls equal to or less than the target number is a single success. Each one that rolls a 1 is a critical success. Any die that rolls a 20 causes a complication. I think this might just be like an editing thing. In the overview, they call rolling a 20 a mishap. here in this next chapter, they call it a complication, and that's how I refer to a critical failure. Yeah, just an editing thing, I think. Let's see. Unless otherwise noted, most skill tests have a basic difficulty of 1. More routine and straightforward skill tests may have a difficulty of 0. More complex can have higher. Let's see. Like we've kind of talked about everything else. Setting difficulties, GM guidance. Setting difficulty is more an art than a science in most cases. GMs often will learn to gauge an appropriate difficulty with a little experience. The biggest factor is the chance of getting multiple successes. So scoring 1 success is relatively easy. 2 is challenging, but not impossible. 3 or 4 are tough to score reliably with only 2 dice. 5 or more successes cannot be scored without buying additional dice. So 1, a 3, and a 5 then can be thought of as points at which odds change most dramatically. Most skill tests in a game session should have a basic difficulty of 1. If a test needs to be challenging or arduous, make it a 3. And then if it should be extremely difficult, it should be a 5. And then starting there, you can affect the difficulty based on traits. Then have another sidebar immediately after that. Narrative permission. In short, this refers to whether some element of the fictional world around the characters would enable or prohibit the characters from attempting certain things. Narrative permission is a powerful concept and one the GM has responsibility for adjudicating fairly. Most importantly, the game master should have a sense of whether permission for a skill test can be changed. If a skill test is not possible to attempt, what can the characters do to make it possible? So kind of what I was just talking about. Blah, blah, blah. Is this an entire sidebar, or did they just style it and forget to add? I think it's just styling ran over. Here's a little table for like your basic difficulties, though the rest of what I kind of just read over the last 60, 90 seconds kind of tells you or how I operate. And then difficulty 0 tests, which are actually pretty important. And I've seen come up a lot in Star Trek adventures more often than not. If a task difficulty is 0, it doesn't require dice to be rolled. It should be automatically successful with 0 successes, no risk of complications. However, because no roll is made, it can't generate momentum. So at the GM's discretion, a character can still choose to roll the dice against a difficulty of 0 and can generate momentum as normal. Every success generated on the task becomes and converts into momentum because the difficulty was 0. But this comes at the normal risk of complications as well. The sort of difficulty 0 task be quite useful if it's important to see how successful a character is, but there's no real chance of failure. I've seen this come up a good bit in Star Trek Adventures actual plays. And it kind of probably depends on the GM, but because the characters are so competent, it becomes a way for characters to show off at things that they're just really good at. But like in the world of Star Trek, you're not going to fail at this. It's also a really good way, like talking about that push and pull in the economy of momentum. As a GM, utilizing difficulty 0 tasks in order to give the characters more momentum, and like if what the next scene or in 2 scenes down is going to be and they're running a little low on momentum, you could be really nice, come up with a difficulty 0 task for them to accomplish that lets them generate some momentum to like add to their pool before going into that next like dangerous situation. We do have opposed tests in this system. Normally when a character normally both its characters will attempt a skill test with a difficulty of 1, which can be adjusted like every other way a difficulty can be adjusted. And then if the situation dictates, characters may have different difficulties. So then if the active character succeeds and the reactive character fails, the active character achieves their goal and their test is successful. If the active character fails but the reactive character succeeds, the active character both fails to achieve their goal and the test is over. Some opposed tests have specific additional outcomes for that, probably like combat talents or actions. If both characters fail, because there's a difficulty of 1 assumed, if both characters fail to do anything, nobody gains anything. The active character didn't get what they want, but the reactive character doesn't get any benefit from the fact that the active character failed. And if both succeed, you compare the total momentum generated. The character with the higher momentum wins and achieves their goal, but they lose 1 momentum for each momentum their opponent scored. So if active character won with 2 momentum compared to the reactive character's 1, the active character doesn't then have 2 momentum to spend. they basically, in the fiction, spend one of the momentum defeating the reactive character's momentum generated, and then they have one left over. And that they can spend on talents, asking additional questions, creating an advantage, putting it in their pool. So then I have complications. When you roll a natural 20, critical fail, it's a complication. Most common result of rolling a complication is a negative trait being added or generating threat. Game masters can use complication to inflict a negative trait upon a character. As normal for negative trait, it increases the difficulty of some skill tests, makes certain actions impossible, or if the player just doesn't wish to suffer a complication, or the game master doesn't wish to inflict a complication at that point, the complication can instead be bought off by adding 2 points to the threat pool. The GM may do this and then immediately spend the threat to create a different effect. If we kind of stick to rules as written and say that a complication is rolled and your 2 options are generating threat or adding a negative trait, and the GM wants to do something, but it's not adding a negative trait, which usually just adds to the difficulty of a task, maybe they want to, which we're about to learn, increase the complication range instead, because that fits the story and the fiction better. They can just get the 2 threat and then spend that threat on the complication range. So let's talk about complication range. I love this mechanic a ton. Some circumstances can make a skill test uncertain, though not necessarily more difficult. So these factors increase the complication range for a test, meaning it is more likely that complications occur. If a character has a complication range of 1 normally, meaning they suffer complications for any d20 that rolls a 20, if that range is increased by 1, then it means that they suffer a complication anytime they roll a 19 or 20. If you increase it by 2, it becomes 18, 19, or 20, so forth. It can never be increased to more than 5. I love this mechanic because the game is assuming you're playing a highly competent character where they're not going to fail. And often as a GM, I don't want my characters to fail. It is way more narratively interesting and sometimes just easier if just complications happen. Instead of bumping up the difficulty and just leaving room for your character to just fail at something and there not be like a next thing propelling them, they just fail and everybody kind of sit around figuring out what do we do next. Instead, GMs can just increase the complication range to make it like, sure, this is difficulty 1 task because you're really good at your job, but it's complicated and it's a really sensitive system that you're working on. Or yes, you are very stealthy and should be able to sneak through this field pretty easily, but there's several guards on the lookout for you and you tripped the alarm previously, so they're on alert. So I'm going to increase the complication range, which I think is just a ton of fun. I think it's great. I think it's 1 threat for every bump up of the complication range. So you can spend 1 threat to increase it by 1, so it's a 19 or 20. Spend 2 threats, increase it by 2 to make it 18, 19, 20, etc. Improving the odds. Even the most driven person cannot give their full effort 100% of the time. In tense situations, they need to conserve their energy, capitalize on opportunities, and be willing to take risks to triumph. Thus, the 2d20 system provides a few ways for characters to improve their chances of success by buying additional d20s to roll on a skill test. Each dice allows a character to score more successes and thus reach higher difficulties or simply generate more momentum. A character can't purchase more than 3 additional d20s by any means, so the max amount of d20s a character can ever roll is 5. And those situations would be really, really rare. Like at most you're buying 1 additional d20, and in really big situations you might be buying 2. Almost rarely, very, very rarely are you rolling all 5 d20s. Normal method is by spending momentum. In brief, it's paid from the group's momentum pool because it's done before a skill test is rolled, and costs 1 momentum for the first d20, 2 for the second, and 3 for the third. So it would take 6 momentum total, which I believe is the max amount. That's the max amount of momentum you can have in your party pool of momentum. You would have to be at your max and then spend it all on 1 skill test to go from 2d20 to 5d20. As with any momentum spend, a player can choose to add a threat instead of spending momentum. Perhaps if there isn't enough momentum left in the pool. The cost is the same: 1 threat for one, 2 for the second, 3 for the third. Players may even choose to pay part with momentum and part with threat. If a character buys some dice with momentum and some with threat, the cost remains unchanged regardless of how the cost is being paid. So you'd probably want to buy the first with threat to only generate 1 threat, but then have spend 2 momentum for a second. You then have teamwork and assistance, where characters can work together as a team when attempting a skill test. Like this, the game defaults to a lot of collaboration, makes a ton of sense in Star Trek, and I think for Stargate as well. When more than one character is involved in a skill test, one character is the leader, and other characters are assistants. GM has the final say on whether a character can assist. There might be only limited space, etc., or can imply limitations by increasing the complication range for more people than would really make sense. Game Master should be wary of allowing more than one assistant. So to assist, the players describe how their character is assisting the skill test leader. If the GM agrees, each assistant rolls 1d20 with their own target number and their own focuses, which we haven't talked about, might be in the next chapter, next video, to determine if any successes are scored. So long as the leader generates at least 1 success, then all successes by the assistants count towards the result. Assistants' dice can generate complications as normal. So if the leader fails the test, or if the leader doesn't score any successes, rather, not if they fail the test, but if the leader fails to generate any successes on the test, then it doesn't matter what the assistants did. Even if with the assistants' successes, the test, like they would meet the difficulty, the leader still has to succeed at some level. So if it's a difficulty 3 task and there's 2 assistants plus the leader might only generate 1 success on their own. But if both the other assistants get a success, then they've got their 3 that they need to succeed on the test. And then momentum is also generated. So with a lot of teamwork on a low difficulty task, the party could probably generate a ton of momentum, especially if a couple of characters had a focus that applied. And that's probably why the rules tell the GM to be wary of allowing more than one person, because you could easily, depending on how specific your campaign and your group dynamic is, you get a ton of highly competent people attempting the same thing. They could pop off and generate a ton of momentum, which might be bad, both great for the fiction and the players feel really successful, but might just be bad for the game experience overall if that doesn't make a lot of sense. Call out that assistants don't have to use the same attribute, skill, or focus. Like they are still contributing on their level. So that's part of that meta conversation of, hey, can I help with this? Okay, how are you helping? An example being like a commander giving reassuring their specialist. So the specialist is the leader, but doing like, I don't know, like a knowledge history, but the commanding officer can be doing a presence command check with their own attributes and stuff, because they're helping, not by necessarily like using their hands to do the exact same thing, but like helping in other ways. So here's a big one on momentum and threat. See bonus momentum. Some situations, items, and talents grant bonus momentum under specific circumstances. Regardless of how it's granted, bonus momentum can't be saved. It has to be used when it's granted. Here's some examples of spending momentum. Most uses for momentum can only be used once on any given skill check, or once by each character in a round. Some uses can be used repeatedly and will be noted as such, normally noting the effect as per momentum spent, or by marking that use as repeatable. Once a character's skill test has been resolved, any unspent momentum is added to the group's pool. Momentum that can't be added to the group pool because it's already full is lost if it's not spent. 6 momentum at any time is a limit. Momentum only needs to be spent as required, so a character doesn't need to choose how much momentum they wish to take from the group pool until they choose to spend it, and it doesn't need to be spent all at once. At the end of each scene, 1 point of momentum from the group pool is lost. Momentum must be maintained and not last forever. Totally makes sense for the both in fiction and mechanically. Mechanically, you don't want the party to kind of game their way into highly succeeding on low difficulty tasks to get a ton of momentum, and then that's not what momentum is supposed to represent. While it's in the fiction, like momentum might carry, really is supposed to demonstrate advantages you created for yourself in that scene. And sometimes those advantages can carry over into the next scene, but you're certainly not carrying momentum with you episode to episode. In fact, I think it's, or mission, not necessarily a game session. I think that's probably called out too, is that like momentum resets after a mission or episode. Timing momentum. Majority of uses of momentum come immediately after a successful test, or a few important uses for momentum happens at other times. These options have their own restrictions on how and when they're used, be made clear in the text. Buying extra d20s, increasing an opponent's test difficulty are the two most common. Strictly speaking, characters don't know about threat, but they will have a sense of the stakes of a situation and the potential for things to go wrong. And these are things that these are what threat represents. Threat comes from action, much as momentum does. PCs and NPCs alike will increase threat during play. That threat is spent by the GM to create consequences and raise the stakes during different scenes. In this way, threat serves as a visible cause and effect for the game, with actions and consequences linked by the rise and fall of the threat pool, which I love. The GM typically begins each adventure or episode or mission, however, whatever your game calls it, with 2 threat for each player character, though this can be adjusted based on the tone and underlying tension of a given adventure. If the stakes are high, the GM may begin with more threat, while a calmer, quieter situation may reduce the GM's starting threat. I have this idea for my Stargate 2D20 game that kind of inspired by what Wyvern Gaming did with their 5e game a couple years ago, is that each mission or episode gets this, like in the 5e Wyvern game, got this kind of like tension dice mechanic that like each mission ahead of time is kind of graded on a scale of like, is this a fun romp with some like backwoods farmers that just need like, and it's going to be mainly like role play casual, like so the threat die is like a d4, but it could go all the way up to a d12 if the episode is infiltrating a Goa'uld like main like battle cruiser and rescuing a beloved NPC. I really love that mechanic because oftentimes the characters and the player or the viewers, the characters and the viewers of a episode might go into an episode knowing how important or dangerous the episode is, or you might know like at the end of the cold open. Star Trek was great for that. Like it starts with just a mission log statement, but by the time they fade to black the first time and go to the theme song, usually the central conflict of the episode has been established. And sometimes, oh, okay, this episode is going to be pretty chill. You can always be surprised, but you kind of know like, oh, this episode might be chill even if emotionally damaging. But if it's going to be dangerous and like super threatening, you probably know that by the time the theme song starts playing too. So I'm thinking about in my Stargate 2D20 game, like establishing a mechanic before a mission or an episode begins, coming up with a scale for how much threat a game master would start with. Or like if it's maybe that's just a low, medium, or high game, or like maybe you start at medium, low, high. I think it's interesting because then maybe it's not something you reveal at the beginning of the episode, but maybe like after the first, like you establish the scene and you kind of get to whatever that central conflict is, and then the GM reveals how big his threat pool is. I could see it being this dramatic event. Like, I know it's a threatening episode. The players don't necessarily know, but then 30 minutes into the session, the conflict reveals itself, and I move my mason jar of threat tokens out from behind my GM screen, and they see that I've probably started with 3 threat per character, and it looks a lot like there's a ton of threat. Like, oh crap, we're in a high threat episode. And then there's like this mechanic and language for the players to ask for a low threat episode. Like maybe there's been several episodes, maybe there's been a couple months worth of sessions where it's been pretty like high stakes with a lot going on, and doing the equivalent of a D&D shopping episode. It's like, hey, can we have a low threat episode after this one? I think that's really healthy conversation to happen. And whenever a game can provide that kind of like language for everybody to be aware of and like grab onto and use to kind of like have healthy conversations about desires of like whatever comes next. I think that's super useful. I love the idea of using this like potentially escalating amount of threat that a GM starts with, using that as a way of kind of notifying or have an extra describer on episodes, which just seems really cool. Like we've already established, players can add threat instead of spending momentum to do things. The GM can gets threat by buying off complications, and the GM can spend threat to escalate a situation by ruling specific actions or decisions risk escalation by making the situation more dangerous. This might be like using lethal force in a game where such violence is frowned upon, or carrying heavy weapons into a populated area. If a character performs an action that risks escalation, they immediately add 1 to threat. Player characters don't spend threat, it's spent to challenge or threaten them. Game Master can add to threat by creating threatening circumstances. Environment or circumstances of a new scene may be threatening or perilous enough to warrant to add 1 or 2 threat to the pool automatically. Maybe this is kind of how we like describe it in the Stargate 2D20 games. Like you start normally, but like here's the like in my game prep, I know here's where I add extra threat because of the threatening circumstances. And maybe like in the rules it says 1 or 2. What if that was like 1 to 5? And if it was a super threatening situation, just like taking a 5 threat tokens and just putting it in my pile 30 minutes into a session, the person would be like, oh shit, like I kind of love that. NPC character momentum. NPCs with unspent momentum can't save it like PCs can. They don't have a momentum pool. Instead, NPC may spend momentum to add threat. So basically, like, I get what they're like from a game dev wise, not wanting to like have to think about like being able to talk about things as just momentum, like successes on checks. But what happens when it's the NPCs like opposing the party? There's just a way of saying like, well, we call it momentum, so all the things you would use momentum for still counts for the NPCs, but really that's just threat with a 1-to-1 conversion rate. The threat pool serves as a mirror to the player's momentum, so therefore NPCs may use threat in all the ways PCs would use momentum. Any action or choice where a PC would normally add 1 or more points to threat, an NPC performing that same action must spend an equivalent number of threat. If an NPC suffers a complication, the GM may buy it off by spending 2 threat. Game Master can create a negative trait by spending 2 threat. This must come naturally from some part of this current situation. I'd also say that you could probably do this by like at the start of a new scene. Well, it wasn't planned that the power was going to be turned off, but because of something you did in the previous scene, I'm going to spend 2 threat, and this is essentially like the complication that you rolled earlier, and I'm making the situation worse. I'm like having this negative trait that you might have to like spend some time working on. Then reinforcements. Game Master may bring in additional NPCs during a scene. Minor NPCs cost a threat each, where notable NPCs cost 2. This does not apply to NPCs present at the start of the scene, just additional ones that arrive while the scene's playing out. And there also be logical reasons for why those reinforcements arrived. And then environmental effects or narrative changes. Spend threat to do that kind of stuff. Fortune. So fortune and determination are similar mechanics, and your game will only use one or the other. Is there a term? So I'm used to determination. This is one of the things that SRD kind of has benefit, or like signals out something as a SRD and not just here's some basic rules to run. Like this is a system reference document that developers or GMs use to create their own version. Fortune, I'm used to determination because that's the mechanic subsystem in Star Trek Adventures, and I like determination compared to fortune and what the term itself seems to imply and describe. Let's read the first paragraph and see if I prefer one or the other. PCs have access to a special resource called Fortune. Fortune reflects the fact that the PCs are the game's protagonists, with ambition, drive, and miraculous luck beyond that of most people. Such individuals shape their own fates by action and will, and the fate of the world around them often follows suit. Whether they are regarded as heroes in any traditional sense, PCs are larger than life. Player character begins each adventure with 3 fortune points, can't have more than 5. Okay, let's look at what determination. I have access to a special resource called determination. It reflects the fact that the game's pretend ambition, grabbing grit beyond that as most. So we're kind of removing the language of like luck and it being more character focused, centric, proactive, as opposed to something that is just kind of around, which I do think everything is the same. So we'll just go with determination, assuming I'm going to use determination. So determination depends on values, which isn't always a thing. So let's check this out. So determination can be used to pull off exciting stunts, provide an edge, or otherwise help advance the story. Characters gain and spend determination from acting in accordance with their beliefs, represented by their values, or drives if you're using that variant. When a character's values aid them in what they're seeking to achieve, they get the opportunity to spend determination, while they can gain determination when a character's immediate goals and values conflict with one another. Each character or each PC begins each adventure with 1 determination point and cannot have more than 3. So basically, during the difference between determination and fortune is fortune just is around. You don't necessarily have to use extra part of character creation called values that help like determine who your character is in the world. And I think that's the difference between like what they were like the word that got changed is from luck to grit. So it's something about your character in determination that is allowing you to get this extra resource and spend it, compared to fortune, where it's not necessarily, it is about your character, but it's more about like the entire fiction of the world, that literal plot armor. And it doesn't necessarily, like, you being able to spend fortune doesn't necessarily need to be like tie into who you are as a person. You can spend a fortune point during a skill test to automatically change a die to being a natural 1 and 2 successes. You have to select it before dice are rolled. You can spend a fortune point to re-roll all of the dice in your dice pool. You can do it to immediately take a major action on your turn in action and conflict. You can spend a fortune point when they're defeated. You can immediately create a trait that applies to the current scene, or you can immediately gain the use of a single talent that you don't possess. And you get 3 of those. You can never have more than 5, and you award a GM should sometimes award a fortune point to a player in the group for a particularly noteworthy action. So consider this kind of like what inspiration kind of become in D&D, or like something meta, like the GM rewarding a player for something the player did, or the GM may choose to award fortune points to all players based on their progress in a campaign or during the transition between key scenes. They make excellent rewards when they reach certain narrative milestones or defeat an important villain, solve a mystery, or survive a tense encounter. They can be spent immediately and thus provide instant gratification. Where compared to determination, when you attempt a skill test or are otherwise in a difficult situation and one or more of your values would be helpful in your current situation, you may spend a point of determination. And when you do, it's probably the same, same rewards and stuff to spend that determination. You just have it a lot less. And your ability to spend it is fewer because it has to come in with your values. Values, if you've ever built a character in Star Trek Adventures before, kind of like short phrases that are little like pieces of truth about your character and who they are as a person. I like determination because you gain determination by the GM kind of challenging one of your values. So it's a way to keep values in the game, where like if you think about 5th edition has the like bonds, what are they called? We do them so infrequently, they're often just left blank completely. Like the whole section of a character sheet where you like fill in like descriptions about who your players, like attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs and bonds and stuff. But often we'd never do that because there isn't a mechanical reason to, like a mechanical way to tie those in. They're really just there for the story, for the DM to use them. Determination and values kind of go hand in hand. Values are similar to like attitudes, behavior, and stuff, but they're just simple truths about who you are as a character. Another person should be able to like read your list of values and get a pretty good sense of who they are as a person. So you get determination when you attempt a skill check or otherwise in a difficult situation, and one of your values would make your situation more difficult. And the GM may ask you to make the following choice. You can comply. You choose to give in to your values, suffering a complication as a result. The complication may make your chosen course of action more difficult or may even prevent you from attempting the action. Instead, you have to do something else. You can discuss with your GM as how this plays out. Once that adverse complication happens, you gain the point of determination. Or you can challenge your value and you choose to go against it. You cross out the challenged value as it's no longer vital to you as the character as it once seemed, since you were willing to kind of challenge it or do the opposite. And then you continue to resolve the current skill test or situation. Once this is finished, you gain a point of determination. So you get a determination regardless. As a player, it's this really great storytelling mechanic where you, in character creation, you, the player, kind of establish who you think this character is, and then the GM puts it in front of your face and asks, "Are you sure?" Because it's going to make your life more difficult. Does your character really believe in this, or are they willing to sacrifice? Like, are they willing to not follow that value and stick on a like potentially easier path? It's great for character growth and like mechanically showing that character growth. In a Star Trek Adventures game that I play in, I have the value. I created a value for my character that says something like doing it by the book saves lives, and like my character really does believe that. But I know it's going to, if the GM wants to, it could cause a ton of problems for me, because how often in a Star Trek episode is like you have to do it by breaking the rules. Like in order to succeed, you have to break the rules. A well-established trope in Star Trek. So having a character who doesn't believe that, who thinks that following the book saves lives, vitally important that we follow procedure, that's going to come up a ton. But that value is going to get challenged, and I, the player, in the moment, depending on what happens in the story, I get to determine, does this guy really believe that? And he's willing to make his life more difficult, potentially like have something terrible happen because he believes in this value so much? Or is he willing to challenge that value and do it? So I love determination. I think I'm going to stick with determination in my Stargate game, like at my table, just because I love that as a storytelling mechanic. And I think creating values, while it makes character creation longer and more involved, that involvement makes the player understand their character way more even before the first session, which I think is just great. And that's a huge win for me, is if character creation is involved enough to where there's a mechanical description of the understanding the player has with a character, and like running pre-gens. Like if values are a part of the game system, you didn't have time to create a totally bespoke character. You just got a drop-in player that you weren't expecting. Grab a pre-gen and there's 4 values listed there. You have to instantly understand that character to a pretty good amount. So I think that's great. And challenges are circumstance, situations, or sequence of events that require multiple skill tests to overcome. Few way to do it. Like I'm not going to dig in deep, but just that there are rules in the system for things that need more time than just what a singular skill task would involve. And it's a great way to involve the entire party in a set thing that isn't just 3 assistants assisting a leader in a single skill test. Skill challenges have been part of a lot of systems. It's what you probably think it is in the 2D20 system, but it is represented in here and default to the system. That's going to be it for this video. Covered the overview in chapter 1 of the core rules. I think this was probably pretty helpful for me as like a reminder to how the system works and behaves at its most basic, but also like I play in a Star Trek Adventures game online every other week, so it's helpful for me to get a reminder of how these things work. And as I'm building out my Stargate game, like what are the things that I need to be aware of, things like the challenge dice that I wasn't completely sure of, and there at the end being able to like know for sure, yep, I want to use determination in my game, not fortune. I think it matches the Stargate story fiction a little bit better. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful for you learning the 2D20 system. If you're interested in, if you're a fan of Stargate and like what you just heard about the system, keep watching or check out the playlist linked below for dev diaries, for my hack of Stargate 2D20. I also think this SRD is put together really well. And if you've got a IP or a world that you would love to play in that involves highly competent, proactive players in a group with a lot of collaboration and teamwork, this system would probably work for you. And what we'll talk about next video, attributes and skills, is where you, the game developer, would do most of the customization. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day. Peace out.